Hello, my name's Jane Turner, and thank you for tuning in to listen to the journey that I went on when I wrote my first book. And before I get started, I want to say that while I'll be sharing a lot of my story with you here, this talk isn't actually about me, it's about you and the way you can use the things that I'm telling you here to change anything in your life that isn't working for you. Now, there are three themes that are running through this talk. And the first one just happens to be one of my favourite topics of all time, which is the hero's journey. And specifically, it's about how the hero's journey can help us to keep a healthy perspective around any adversity that we might encounter. And the second one is about the value of finding our purpose. And last but not least, there's the question of what can happen when we get out of our comfort zone. Now, I got to find out what it feels like to be out of my comfort zone in a big way back when I was made redundant at the age of 52 after spending my whole working life as an employee of the Australian government. And admittedly, being made redundant was nothing short of traumatic, especially when I thought I had a job for life. But in the end, it was actually the best thing that could have happened to me. And I say that because having been knocked out of my comfort zone allowed me to not only tap into resources within myself that I never even knew I had, but I also got to find out what it meant to discover my purpose. It's that dent in the universe we've been given the gift of life to make, which in my case turned out to be helping people to share their story and their wisdom by becoming a published author. And I can do that now because of the things I learned and the experiences I had through the process of writing my first book. And that book that I launched in 2015 called Thrive in Midlife actually changed my life. And I say that because I was barely recognizable when I launched that book. There I was out at networking events and using social media like a pro. And as one of my friends said to me at the time, "Oh my God, Jane, you seem to be everywhere. I can't open up Facebook or LinkedIn without seeing you talking about your book all over the place." Because you see, my transformation was a real shock to the people who knew me when I was comfortably ensconced in the workforce. Because being an introvert by nature, there's no way I could have done some of the amazing things I was able to do after becoming the person I needed to become to step up into published author status. But back in the day, I was way too shy to even speak up at a staff meeting, let alone sharing my story in Australia's best-selling women's magazines and on mainstream television shows watched by millions of people. However, by the time I finished Thrive in Midlife, I found myself featured in full-page articles in the Australian Women's Weekly and Prevention magazines, as well as on TV shows like the Today Extra program, the 7:30 Report, and the House of Wellness. And in case you're wondering, all of this happened because I got really good at leveraging published author status to get all sorts of great opportunities, including stacks of free publicity. But the most amazing thing that happened out of writing my first book was that I got an email in my inbox one day from the organisers of the Women's Economic Forum saying that one of their members had just read my book and recommended that they organise for me to speak at one of their events. And that resulted in me standing on a massive stage in India, speaking at a forum that over 2,000 women attended. And to call that a life-changing experience is a massive understatement. So you see, it's actually fantastic what can happen when we get out of our comfort zone. And that's why I love talking about this topic so much, because I'm a great example of someone who could have trundled on forever and never found that spark of joy that I got after I came to terms with the reality of being unemployed. And at the same time realised that I'd found my purpose through the transformation I went through in the process of writing Thrive in Midlife. But fortunately for me, before my book was even finished and I started reaping the rewards of published author status, I stumbled across the Hero's Journey framework. And it was when I was at my lowest ebb, because I couldn't seem to get another job for love nor money. And my stress buttons were being pressed all over the place. So I'm a real fan of the Hero's Journey because it helped me to get a healthy perspective on the adversity that came my way when I lost my job. And so we're going to change gears here now. And what I'm going to do is take a little bit of time to help you to get a handle on the way the Hero's Journey framework works. And I'll be doing that by using the example of the journey I went on in the process of writing Thrive in Midlife. And as you're listening to me, I want you to be thinking about how you can relate the Hero's Journey framework to your own situation. And so what I need you to do now is to think about an old-fashioned round clock face with a line across the middle between the 3 o'clock point and the 9 o'clock point. And imagine me at the 12 o'clock point in 2007, when I was happily collecting a pay slip every fortnight as I'd done since leaving school. And the opportunity for me to get some training in coaching came up, with a view to improving the performance of the teams I was managing at the time. And that experience of learning about coaching sort of woke me up in a sense. Because when I got back to the workplace, I got a real buzz out of seeing the kinds of things that my staff achieved as a result of the coaching that they got. And I thought to myself, well, maybe one of these days I could go out on my own into the real world and start a coaching practice, because I actually loved it. And while I was mulling that idea over, I started to notice that all of the successful coaches out there had written books that positioned them as an authority. So I decided to make a start on writing a book of my own. And what I want to point out to you here is that the idea of writing a book in the context of the hero's journey is what's called the calling. And the calling might seem reasonably inconsequential in terms of the bigger picture at the time, but it ultimately has the ability to completely change the trajectory of our life. So I finally answered that calling to write a book in 2009. And because of that, I started moving beyond the 12 o'clock point, making my way toward the 3 o'clock point, which is an important threshold in the hero's journey framework. But before I got there, those sneaky old limiting beliefs started to kick in, and the nasty little bully that can sometimes wedge itself in the back of our minds started saying all sorts of things like, "Who would want to read a book written by you, Jane Turner? You're not an expert. You're not a good writer. You're not even qualified enough." And while that was really annoying and it slowed me down a lot, it actually made a lot of sense when I got to the point where I could see it all in hindsight. Because the thing that happens at the 3 o'clock point is that a teacher or a guide or a mentor of some kind will show up. And it's their role to help us to step over the threshold that takes us from what's known as the ordinary world in hero's journey language to the special and unfamiliar world. And it was the little voice in my head that was telling me that I wasn't qualified enough that led to me finding my mentor, because I bought into the idea of not being qualified enough and I signed up to do another coaching program. And the thing about the program that I signed up for is that I got to meet a wonderful woman called Lorna Stewart, who was running the course that I'd signed up for. And she was the one that introduced me to the hero's journey. And I'll forever be grateful to Lorna, because finding out about the hero's journey wasn't only helpful from the point of view of being a powerful coaching framework, but it was also a powerful framework for sharing our story, not to mention helping me to adopt a better perspective on my situation, which included being more or less debilitated with fear and resentment because I'd been focusing on what I'd lost in the way of a regular pay slip. And this wasn't only a big deal because the salary that used to come into our household every fortnight had stopped, but also because my sense of security, and in fact, my whole identity, was entwined with that job that I'd just lost. But what learning about the hero's journey enabled me to do was flip the script that I'd been playing out in my head and focus on what great opportunities might actually open up for me now that I didn't have to spend 38 hours of my week tied up with managing people and budgets and the kinds of politics that were involved in the job that I had, and all sorts of other things that, quite frankly, I was much better off without. And having a more empowering perspective to view my position in, along with having a much better understanding of how I could include personal stories to make the book I was writing more impactful and more relatable than it was going to be, is what it took for me to have enough confidence to start writing again. So I started making some real progress for a while there, but as I got closer to the 6 o'clock point, that little voice in my head started up again. And what's more, it really upped the ante by saying things that hit me right in the guts, like, "You're too broken and hopeless to be thinking about exposing yourself by becoming an author, let alone expecting to be able to run a successful business." And with all of that going on in the background, by the time I got to the 6 o'clock point, I'd spent 5 years and well over $30,000 on various writing retreats and courses and such, trying to write the darn book. And the cherry on the top was that I'd just been made redundant at that stage. And what that meant was that I wasn't able to keep myself distracted by going on writing retreats and buying more courses in the way that I'd done for those 5 long years. Because quite frankly, I just couldn't afford to keep doing that anymore. And without the kinds of distractions I was used to having, I started getting really uncomfortable. And why wouldn't I be? Because by that stage, I was way out of my comfort zone, which is exactly what the 6 o'clock point in the hero's journey is all about. Now, what you need to know about the 6 o'clock point is that it's called the crisis point or the ordeal. And when I think about a movie that typifies the hero's journey, it's Star Wars that comes to mind for me. And the 6 o'clock point in Star Wars is when Luke Skywalker is facing off against Darth Vader. And he's not only realizing that Darth Vader is his father, but that he's also the dark part of himself that he doesn't want to own. And in my own case, the 6 o'clock point was about coming to terms with the fact that, as I said earlier, I'd spent over $30,000 on various writing courses and retreats and the like, and I still didn't have a book to launch my coaching practice off the back of, and I'd just gone into menopause, and I'd just been made redundant. And as uncomfortable as all of this was, this is where the massive transformation in terms of the person I became started to take place. And it started with the fact that the little voice in my head that had previously been taunting me about not being qualified enough had started saying things like, "You're going to have to solve the problem you have around that deep, dark secret you've never told anyone about before you expose yourself to the world as a published author." And you know what? It wasn't until I got to the 6 o'clock point that I realized that what I'd spent 5 years stuffing around for was driven by the shame I had around my 40-year history of binge eating disorder. And that's what had been stymieing me in terms of getting my book finished. Because I'd been unconsciously, or maybe semi-consciously, trying to outrun the part of my story that I didn't want to own. And I was trying to do that by getting over, or should I say getting past, my eating disorder so that I could write about it in the past tense. Now, finding this stuff out was critical because in the hero's journey framework, binge eating disorder was my equivalent of Luke Skywalker realizing that Darth Vader was the dark side of himself that he didn't want to own. Meanwhile, the fact that I'd been made redundant and still didn't have a book to launch my coaching practice around was my equivalent of Luke realizing that Darth Vader was his father. But what's really interesting is that at the 6 o'clock point, when I had nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, because I didn't have enough money to buy another course and distract myself in that way, the little voice in my head actually changed its tune. And it didn't say, you're too broken, you're too disgusting, and you'll need to fix this problem you've got with food first so you can write about it in the past tense because it's way too shameful to talk about in the present tense. Well, no, it didn't say any of those things. Instead, it said, what if that's not what it's all about? Now, I didn't understand what that meant at the time, but with that monkey off my back and the sense that maybe I was worthy of stepping up and sharing what I had to share with the world, even if I wasn't perfect, well, with that, I was able to finish my book. And what's more, I got to see what it was all about. And that happened when I was standing up on stage launching Thrive in Midlife, looking at my 14-year-old daughter and her 14-year-old friends who'd come along to support me, God bless them. And without having planned to do this, I found myself saying to those girls, what I want you to know is that there is nothing so broken, so unspeakable, or so unlovable about you that you can't talk to someone about it and know that they will still love you and remind you to love yourself. Now, 9 years later, as I'm talking to you now, I still can't say those words without a well of emotion swelling up inside of me. And you know, the kicker is that it wasn't just those girls who needed to hear that message. It was the 14-year-old girl inside of me that needed to hear it the most. And at that very moment, when I felt those words coming straight from my heart, I got a flash of absolute clarity about the fact that I wasn't put on this earth to help women through the midlife phase, even though I'd just written a book about it. But I was put on this earth to help people to get that feeling that I just had, that feeling of wholeness, that feeling of self-worth, and that feeling of the incredible power of sharing our story. And with that, I came out the other end a very different person. And this is what the hero's journey is all about. If we take our challenges on board, and if we're prepared to step up and do the work, then doors are going to open up for us. And in my own case, the person coming beyond the 6 o'clock point and back into the ordinary world over the threshold at the 9 o'clock point was simply not the same person who started writing a book 5 years earlier. The person you're hearing from now used to call in sick if they were ever going to have to talk at a staff meeting or anything like that. Whereas the person I am now is not stymied by negative beliefs about dysfunctional behavior around food or anything else for that matter, because I know that I don't need to be perfect to be able to help people and to be able to have a good life. And that's the message that I want you to take away from this presentation. And if you feel like you've had a calling of some kind that you've been resisting, well, I'd encourage you to just get down and do whatever you're being called to do. Because I can attest to the amazing transformation that comes out of getting out of our comfort zone and just putting one foot in front of the other. Because it's through following our calling that we get to recognize and to tap into our passion and our purpose. And I tell you what, That's a much more fulfilling space to be in than stagnating in our comfort zone. And so, with that said, what I'd like to do is leave you with a quote from Mark Twain, who said that the two most important days in our life are the day we're born and the day we find out why.